Have you ever wanted to get better lag on your forehand, get that whip and acceleration like the pros do? Well, stay tuned. I'll go over some of my favorite drills for developing lag, and I'll share with you some of the biomechanics and secrets of the lag forehand. Hi, it's Chris Lewit here, top American junior coach and coach to many #1 juniors in the United States. Come join me and let's get into this lag forehand. There's a lot of questions about it, and I've got your answers. Okay, so basically what the lag is a wrist extension. The wrist is extending back, so as players are accelerating, they're firing their legs and their hips, they're getting good rotation, and that rotation is creating this effect. If the wrist is relaxed, the wrist will lag backwards. So typically with like an Eastern or a semi-Western grip, it's going to be, the technical name for it is extension. Your wrist is extending back. So for example, one of the things you can do to help your lag is just do some basic wrist stretches. It seems so simple, but the more range of motion you have in your wrist, the more lag with the typical grip, the more lag you're going to generate. And so what happens is as you're firing the kinetic chain, as the energy is getting transferred up from the legs, from the ground, the legs, hips, and then the trunk, the mass of the racket gets, pushes the wrist back, and then the wrist flings through. It's a reaction to this lag effect. It's not like you're trying to actively flick your wrist forward. So you're not using the muscles of flexion of the wrist. The wrist is extending, and then there's this elastic effect that happens, and the tendons and the musculature that are involved with bringing the wrist into flexion are accelerated through sort of a chain reaction. Energy stored up in the tendons, in the musculature, and then there is a stretch reflex. So without getting deeper into the physiology or the biomechanics of that, just understand that you're not trying to like actively snap your wrists forward. This is a byproduct of good kinetic chain, starting with the ground, the legs, the hips, and the trunk. And then if you're relaxed enough, you'll be able to get a good wrist extension going backwards. If you have more of like a full Western grip, it's a little different because there's still lag, but it may be using the musculature a little bit differently just because of the way the hand is positioned. So, but just in general, lag is like an extension of the wrist. And so one of the things you can do just to help with that right away is make sure your wrist is flexible. If you have a lack of mobility in your wrist, there's no way you're going to be able to get good lag. So if you understand that you're trying to get extreme wrist extension, so it's basically what's called hyperextension, this wrist joint needs to be super relaxed. This is the end of the chain reaction that happens throughout your body from the kinetic chain, from the ground up, and then nearing the end of this chain is the wrist. And so the wrist can accentuate and create a lot of power and acceleration if it's relaxed. So you're never going to get lag if you're stiff. So what I see with most of my students, whether they're adults trying to get lag or they're kids, I work with a lot of high performance juniors, if they're locked, so if they're clenching and if they have tension in their arm or in the shoulder or in the wrist, the lag is just going to be very minimal. And a related component to that is you're not going to get a lot of topspin. So anytime I have players who are struggling with topspin or whip or acceleration, it's usually because they're trying to swing fast, and when they're trying to swing fast, what's really common is everything gets tight through these joints. Sometimes they're called the distal joint. Like distal just means farther away from the body. Proximal is closer to the body. So the shoulder is activating, for example. We know that in biomechanics, but the elbow and the wrist joint they should not be, the musculature there shouldn't be actively contracting. You have to learn how to relax the distal joints, the muscles around the distal joints. So relaxing, let's say bicep, a lot of the muscles of the forearm here, the pronators and supinators, and the muscles that control the wrist as well. So that you can't, all the way into the hand and the fingers. Getting down to the grip, the fingers have to be contracting because you have to hold on to the grip. But a lot of these muscles interconnect and have multiple actions here. So it's really tricky to be firm with your fingers around the grip, because you don't want the handle to, you don't want to release the racket, but relaxed in the wrist. So I have to hold the grip relatively firmly, but I have to keep my wrist relaxed. And I want to keep my elbow also from being locked, you know. And then I'm going to use the rest of the big muscle groups in the kinetic chain to send energy through the kinetic chain. And hopefully, if I'm relaxed well here, I can get that lag effect. So one of the things I recommend is just choke up on the racket and just start to get like some little whips through here. You can, as you're swinging, don't be locked here. Just learn how to relax this wrist joint. You can start to get this. I don't know if you can hear that, but you can hear a little wind sound through the strings. So that can be helpful, just to get loose through here. Some people use a towel and just kind of like whipping a towel. It's a lot like skipping a rock, you know. So you want to get this wrist relaxed, and if you don't get that, you're never going to get lag, or you get very minimal lag. So that to me is like the biggest hurdle and challenge for most people who are trying to learn this. They don't have a relaxation in their arm, and especially the distal part of the arm, and their wrist. And there's no like elasticity. They're very stiff when they swing. So if you're stiff, it just kills your lag. So you have to learn to be relatively relaxed. And then what you can do is you can take a ball or two and just try to, don't hit it hard, just hit it reasonably, and just try to get that feeling, even just choking up here, of the racket. The racket will make a little squiggle back here. That's a good way to think it. Sometimes I just call it like that because, you know, when you're teaching, you don't use too many scientific terms. You try to get people to understand what should happen here. You should feel a stretch and a whip through here. And the other thing I think is kind of interesting, when you're first learning this, I think it's the opposite of what I said earlier. You might have to think about like flicking a little bit. You might have to think about sort of like, you might use the wrist a little bit at a slow speed. And I've always felt that way. On certain shots, you're actually going to activate the wrist more. You might even use the flexors of the wrist when they're like a slow speed angle, or certain shots that are close to the net. When you whip it through, you're actually going to use your wrist. I think advanced players do use their wrist, even though that's sort of like taboo to say that. But we know from like at high speed and a full kinetic chain windup, a big swing, is the wrist is not going to be very active. But there's lots of like little cute shots, angle shots, up close shots, whipping shots, where I think pros and I myself definitely use the wrist on those shots, but they're like slower speed whipping shots or shorter whipping shots. So I think that's something that nobody really talks about. That's true. So I think that when you're learning, you can try to use, it's okay to use your wrist a little bit at slow speeds. The danger that most people are worried about is when people don't really use the kinetic chain well. Mark Kovacs has talked about this a lot, and I think he's absolutely right. Like people, they don't really load the system well, they don't get the kinetic chain working, and then they just try to like slam this thing with their wrist, and that's probably a bad idea, and there's a chance you could injure your wrist or your elbow doing that. So I think, ironically, learning this, I think you can actively kind of like, quote unquote, snap or flick. I use the word flick a lot when I'm teaching, but I would never use the word flick in the sense of like a biomechanical analysis. If you're looking at the actual joint rotations and how much, what muscles are firing, and in terms of like actively contracting the wrist for flexion, in that context, like the scientific context, it's not really, there's not really a snap. But when you're learning, you just use the word snap or flick, and you know it's kind of controversial these days. But I really believe that at low speeds, that's an easy way to most people conceptualize, you know, lag that way. It's kind of like a flick or a snap or some type of whipping action. So and when you're learning, you can kind of do that a little more actively, and then it becomes more of a passive stretch reaction using the stretch shortening cycle and using a tendon reflex, which is more scientific. That comes when you start to load the entire kinetic chain and the whole thing. There's this whole like explosion that happens, and it's more like a passive action of the wrist. But I think because when you're learning, you maybe don't have the entire kinetic chain yet. You would not expect the entire movement of the wrist to be passive when you're learning. But then when you get to higher levels, that's absolutely, you know, I think the science is pretty clear. that happens at the highest speeds when you're maximally loading and exploding using the kinetic chain. So I would like to throw my 2 cents in and just say, I think the pros do use the wrist. If you talk to any pro who hits a forehand or a serve, they say, yeah, I use my wrist. The serve, maybe not, because we know that pretty much every serve is maximal, and the wrist is mostly a passive actor. But I think there are forehand and backhand situations where pros definitely use the wrist. Most pros will just say, well, I always use my wrist, or to get more spin, I use my wrist. I mean, my old coach, Gilad Bloom, who is an amazing player on the Pro Tour, was 61 in the world, he always used to tell me to use my wrist. You know, like many top coaches say, use your wrist. Moratoglu says to use your wrist. And they don't mean it in the sense that I'm talking about. I'm talking about short, little shots, angles, shots where you're putting diagonal spin on the ball when you're up close to the net. There's definitely some more wrist action in those cases. Sometimes you might get caught late and have to flick your wrist in certain situations. But strictly speaking, scientifically, in a normal shot where you're loading and exploding, the wrist is more passive. And so that's where we get into this controversy, and there's disagreements about it. So if you understand that there's 2 things that almost nobody talks about that you need to have to get lag, you can see why so many people get led astray. What do you need? You need to have mobility in your wrist. Literally, the good old-fashioned stretch you may have done in gym class in high school or middle school is really important for lag. So if you have a lack of wrist mobility, it's going to affect your ability to lag. And we know the pros get this extreme hyperextension in the wrist. The wrist gets laid back like incredible amounts. They're super. If you look at a forehand of Sinner or Alcaraz, it's pretty amazing how far the wrist actually hyperextends. That means all these other muscles are that contract the wrist are being put on stretch, and the related tendon structures, and then they fling back like a slingshot. That's the reflex, the stretch reflex. Sometimes it's called the SSC, or the stretch shortening cycle. A good example is just take your finger back. I like this little trick. Take your finger back and let it go, and you'll see how fast your finger moves. Even you can do your whole wrist this way. And if you try to do that actively, it won't be nearly as fast. Like the wrist will move much faster with actually very little energy used when you release it, versus if you just try to flick your wrist like this, or your fingers. You can just feel the energy just storing up here, and you release it super fast with no actual energy cost. It's like a free energy exchange, or free energy creation from the tendons and from the musculature being stretched. It's really cool. There's a spindle action there. On another video, maybe we can go into the biomechanics of that, but it's a very cool phenomenon in the body. If you stretch tendons and muscles and then you release them, you get a free energy, or that movement of the joint, and you get an incredibly fast action. So that's sort of the science there. So how do we get this thing? You need to have the mobility, and then you need to have a relaxed arm and relaxed distal joints. You can't clench up. You can't contract through these joints near the end of your arm, near the end of the kinetic chain. So I just call them the distal joints, the joints that are far away. So those 2 things are essential. If you don't have those 2 things, you can't get good lag. And all the pros have figured out how to swing fast, but they have great range of motion, great mobility, flexibility in their wrist, and they're able to keep their arm loose, kind of like a spaghetti arm, at the end of the kinetic chain here. Just like if you're holding a whip and the end of the whip is loose and the handle of the whip is strong and firm. So if you can try to think about it that way, you'll understand the 2 key ingredients that are essential. And then, this is really hard to teach, because the first thing I usually do is I have to make sure people have good flexibility, range of motion in their wrist. Sometimes I stretch people out. And then the other thing I have to do is when people are swinging, they have to stay super relaxed. So I gave you the example of this little drill here where you're choking up and just learning to sort of relax back here. But what happens is, and this is really I think the thing that gets a lot of people, is that when people try to swing fast, they clench. they contract all through these joints. And that is such a common phenomenon, so you've got to watch out for that. I would say that's like the third key. It's when you swing fast, you have to learn to swing fast. You're definitely going to use your shoulder, but can you relax your elbow? Can you relax your wrist? And can you squeeze your fingertips? So you got like a contraction in your fingers, hand muscles, but a relaxation in the actual wrist musculature, a relaxation most likely in the elbow joint, and then there's a contraction. Well, there's probably some active contraction and also some passive movement of the shoulder. It gets a little more into the biomechanics. There's definitely passive action of the shoulder, like the internal rotators of the shoulder. But if you can just imagine, there's a lot of muscles contracting closer to the center of the body, proximal to the center of the body, and then as you move out distally, there has to be this relaxation, and then when you get to the final distal joints, which are the fingers, they have to be contracted. So that's why it's really, really tricky. And most people either like contract all of them, or they loosen all of them and throw their racket into the net or something. So you have to have this combination of like contraction, relaxation, contraction, and that's where people really, really struggle. So I would say that's the third biggest challenge. So now that you understand a little bit of the science and like what are the challenges here, like if you don't have range of motion, if you're not able to relax your arm, if you clench a lot, I mean, just forget it. Like you're gonna have a classic forehand. You're gonna have a classic forehand or backhand, because backhand has a lot of similar components, although it's a little more complex because there's two arms working, but you're not going to get lag, and maybe you don't need it. Maybe just stay with a nice classic swing and you'll be a little more locked in here. And there's been players for decades going back in tennis history who played with a pretty locked wrist and they hit the ball amazingly well. If you think of classic players from the 70s and the 80s like Chris Lewit or Jimmy Connors or many, many pros from that era, the golden era of tennis, I mean, most of them didn't play with a lot of lag. There's always a few examples. People say, you know, Borg or Laver, but most of the pros were pretty locked with their distal joints here. So that's just a fact. I mean, I don't know how people can argue against that. So you might want to just keep that. You know, it might not be possible, just physiologically possible, anatomically possible. If you had a wrist surgery, or if you have a tight don't have a lot of range of motion in your wrist for some reason, you have some orthopedic challenges in your elbow or wrist, this may not even be possible. But let's say you want to go for it. I have the best drill for you. So what you do is you set up over the years, I tried to figure out how do I teach this without actually like A, injuring someone, because there's all sorts of things that can go wrong with the timing of the wrist, and B, like do it in a way that, I was trained by Luis Bruguera, and he believed that you should teach with parameters. He's a famous, the godfather of Spanish tennis, Luis Bruguera. And he always believed that you shouldn't try to like adjust every single detail. The best way to teach is find the right exercise, find parameters, find the right drill, so you put people sort of in a box with parameters, and then based on what you ask them to do, they will sort of find intuitively the right technique. You can guide them. It's sort of like a guided discovery method. Luis Bruguera was big on the guided discovery method. In today's sports science, we have what's called ecological dynamics, which is a similar concept in terms of education, learning, and motor learning. But basically, ecological dynamics are where you set up parameters and sort of let the technique of a player develop. Sometimes it works great, sometimes it doesn't. Some people need, I believe, a little more technical instruction and biomechanical, scientific technique development, and others miraculously are able, if you give them the right parameters, are able to develop world-class technique, which is really cool. So in this case, I think I came across the best exercise ever to develop the lag and the whip, and it doesn't require a lot of scientific engineering of the stroke, which I think is ideal if possible. So what I do is I just set up high string about 3 or 4 feet above the net, and then what I ask players to do, essentially what I ask players to do when they're learning lag is when I want them to whip, is I ask them to hit spin, heavy spin, in the service box. And I put them up close. So when you're up close here, it's very difficult to hit a ball with height and also get it to go short. And what I found was, just through experimentation, this is really cool, that if you work on this enough with kids in mini tennis, sort of in mini tennis land, warm-up land, instead of going like all the way back, which most people do to learn lag, if you actually try to learn lag when you're up close, it works like magic for most people. Some people may need more engineering, and fortunately I have the biomechanical expertise to do that, but this is a much more efficient, I think, and more natural way to teach lag and get whip. So basically, you just focus on your mini tennis. Here's a really simple drill. I set up this barrier, this high string. It's a great example of what Luis Bruguera would advocate, the guru coach Luis Bruguera. So you find the right exercise. Okay, I have this barrier here, and I want the player to hit a lot of spin and make it fall into the service box. In fact, I might even say sometimes, hey, don't hit a lot. I might not even mention spin. I mean, because the only way you're going to hit a ball over this string that goes in the box is with heavy spin. So the player could even just learn that through trial and error. So basically, you set up here and you try to spin the ball, which is really hard to do. That one was pretty good, you know, but as I get warmed up here, and it's not the fastest speed, you know. Remember, you don't have to, I think probably a lot of rec players, they try to learn lag by, you know, maximally accelerating. That's not the best way to do it. Start up close. You got to swing fast because you have to generate some energy here. But you're not trying to like kill the ball. That was a good one. So you try to get a lot of topspin. You can hopefully hear the spinny sound there, and you work on that with the drill. You can toss to yourself, really easy to do, like I'm doing here. And you try not to tense up here. What happens to most people is they get the feeling, and when the ball actually comes, or if they're in a match, or if they're actually hitting, everything tight. They don't even realize how tight they're getting through here. So you have to really be in tune with what's happening back in this space, when the racket goes behind where you normally look. And back here, you have to be relaxed. And most people tighten up right about this moment. They get real tight, you know. So try to be squiggly. You want to be squiggly, and you don't have to kill the ball. And you want to get that height. You want to try to avoid the net, and you work on getting a nice spinny sound. I put a big cone over there just as a target. And the goal, most people will be too tight, and this takes time, you know, like I kind of make it look easy. It's not easy at all. It's very difficult. You got to work on it, and you don't go back. You just do a lot of your practice up here until you can get enough whip and enough spin to make it dip in there. So I say like whip and dip. And then you can do the same exercise like hitting with someone. You can do mini tennis and work on it that way, just trying to get that heavy spin and the relaxation in your arm. As you get better, you can start swinging faster and faster. So as you get more comfortable with the lag and staying relaxed with your wrist, the wrist hyperextension, you can start to swing a little quicker, you know. You can start to use more kinetic chain, and then you can work on it. You can work on actively, you know, firing the legs and hips more. But like I said in the beginning, a lot of this is just you can actually like actively use the wrist in a safe way, not too fast speeds. You're up close, and then you can slowly kind of work your way back to the baseline and start hitting lightly with the same lag effect. So that's my absolute favorite exercise. And then you play mini tennis with your partner or coach, and you work on the same thing. Do not go back until you can dip the ball with high spin into the short service box area. And most people, when they're starting out, are going to be too tight, and the ball just, everything's locked. And over time, you have to learn to get the squiggle, to get the nice whipping action. And then, you know, a couple bonus tips are there's a lot of other little details that you work on to get you know, the modern forehand or the ATP forehand. That basically what the pros are all doing. One of the most important ones is ISR, which is this rotation here. So like bonus tip and drill is I would definitely try to work on that. And so what you do is you practice hitting the ball, lifting up, and then immediately rotating over. And it starts to promote the internal shoulder rotation. It looks kind of like a lot of times it's called a windshield wiper. So I think that's an extra bonus that, you know, you want to, if you can combine the lag with a good wiper action. So if you got something that looks like this, just do it slowly for you guys. You lag and then you wiper. And this is something we've talked about in other videos, and I can do some more forehand videos where we kind of delve into the biomechanics of this or the more intricate science of this. But basically this really helps you get spin. It won't help you if you're locked. It works in concert with the lag. The lag helps to increase the racket speed, and then as the racket's flinging through, you internally rotate your shoulder and you get that nice wiper action here. So I would say that's a bonus if you can think about that. And the other thing I would think about is as you're getting a little better at this, you know, in the beginning you can just sort of like work on the wrist action, and then you can start to add the kinetic chain. In my experience, it's this would be my best advice to you is try to work on the open stance and semi-open stance. So when you're working on spin and lag, I've always found that my students learn this a lot easier using a semi-open stance, loading and exploding. So what that looks like is instead of trying to do it closed like this, look, I can hit a good forehand this way, but it's hard to get a feeling for the hips rotating and the hips sort of pulling the racket through quickly, which is what causes the lag. So in my experience, what really unlocks the lag forehand, the top spin, is the semi-open stance. That looks like this. I don't know if you can see my feet here, but semi-open stance is here. And then learning to explode the hips like that, that rotation there is really critical. You can see what my old coach Gilad Bloom talks about is a 90-90 position. You get that 90-90 position, you load and explode. And then this, if you combine this with the squiggly that I was mentioning, the squiggle, the lag here, the relaxation in the wrist, you can really start to get the feeling of the proper kinetic chain sequencing and whipping the racket through. And then, so after you load and squiggle, then you add the upward brush with ISR and the wipering action, and you should be starting to approximate getting close to a modern ATP forehand. So that's really, really cool. So those are kind of the steps. You start out close and you learn to relax and whip this thing. You have those three challenges that you have to overcome: mobility, staying loose, and then not clenching when you start to swing fast. And then you have the other components of the modern forehand that are critical, which are wipering, ISR, and loading and using the full kinetic chain to fling the racket through and actually start to create the lag, not by contracting the wrist, but through passive movement of the wrist. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this discussion about the lag forehand. We talked about the things that could prevent you from getting lag, sort of physiological, anatomical things. So those are really important to just make sure that you're able to do lag and you can do it safely. And then I showed you my all-time favorite exercise or sort of progressions that you can use to develop lag. And it's all about like mini tennis and hitting heavy spin short. And the only way you're going to hit heavy spin short, really spin the ball and get it to dip short, is by generating lag. You're not going to be able to do it with a stiff wrist. So that's the key. If you understand that, don't get frustrated. Stick with it. Try to get the squiggly in your wrist. Make sure you have the mobility. Make sure you're not clenching. And then if you can get the spin over like a high string into the service box, that means that you don't even have to check the video. You know you're starting to get lag, because it's the only way you can whip the racket through at a relatively high speed to do that. And then don't forget the sort of like bonus tips or bonus techniques. You got to be able to wiper. You have to have a good wiper. The wiper is like very connected to the spin element in the modern forehand. So you don't want to be like, to like tightly follow through like this. You want to wipe her over. So you lift up and wipe her. And then how do you get the kinetic chain like linking with the lag? You got to load, and I recommend open stance, semi-open stance. Work on your open stance, semi-open stance. In my opinion, most coaches try to teach lag. They do it with the closed stance, and I just think that's not, you can do that. I just don't think it's the most optimal or efficient way to do it. I know some very famous coaches who teach it that way. So in my opinion, in my experience, 20, 25 years coaching, coaching some of the best juniors in the country, and everybody up and down the rankings and adults, my experience is the semi-open is what unlocks the kinetic chain and lets people feel. It's much easier to feel the hips opening and then like connect it with the lag. So if you're familiar with the coach Oscar Wagner, who's a huge proponent of open stance and the like more natural way to hit the ball, I've actually found that that's true for my students. I'm a big supporter of learning with a semi-open or open stance so that they can get the feeling of rotation, and then I sort of tie it into the lag. So that's my best advice for you. I hope you guys experiment with this. Drop a comment. Let me know if any of this works for you. If it doesn't work for you, you're going to be one of those people who needs more of like the engineering, the step-by-step guidance, maybe hands-on haptic guidance. I do a lot of haptic guidance, a lot of hands-on manipulation with my students to try to get them to feel the stroke, and you may need lessons like that. You may need like basically surgery or engineering. But if you're lucky, you may be able to learn just with the drill that I showed you here and a few of my guidelines, and that's a much more efficient and more economical as well way of learning the modern lag forehand. So good luck, and let me know how it goes. Guys, if you like this high quality instructional video, check out another awesome forehand video right here. And you can come train with me for real in Manchester, Vermont. See you there.